Welcome back to Franchise Player, and today we are checking out one of, if not the best Dragon Ball games of all time, which is Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure for the Game Boy Advance. This game ended up releasing here pretty late in the US. It came out all the way back in June of 2006, and Japan did get this a little earlier back in November of '04, but man, what a game this is. It always surprises me that more people actually don't know about this game, and with it being a late Game Boy Advance release, I guess that kind of makes sense because the DS had already been out for a while. But if you haven't heard of this game or if you've never played it, then you definitely need to give it a shot because this is easily one of the most underrated Game Boy Advance games of all time. And for all the hardcore Dragon Ball fans out there, this has everything you want in terms of the story. It starts off with Goku meeting Bulma, and all the way up to the big fight with King Piccolo and everything in between. Over the past few days, I went back and beat this again on my Game Boy Advance. I have the Japanese version just because the US game is so expensive, but it was really fun going back through the Dragon Ball story. And I don't know, this might be kind of a hot take. I mean, there's a lot of times where I actually prefer Dragon Ball over Dragon Ball Z. The story on this is just simple, fun, has some comedy, and of course a decent amount of action as well. What's pretty cool about this game is it doesn't really get stale, and that's for a couple reasons. One, the game is mainly a beat 'em up, as you can tell from the gameplay here on screen, which beat 'em ups in my opinion are pretty much always a good time. Even like mediocre ones are still pretty fun, but on top of that, outside of being a beat 'em up, it's a pretty solid action platformer, especially for the GBA, and at this point in the GBA life cycle, developers definitely knew what they were doing and they could really push the system to its limits. Another thing that surprised me about this game after going back to it all these years later is, I knew this game was a classic, right? But the controls are extremely fluid for a Game Boy Advance game. The controls are pretty simple, right? With it being a Game Boy Advance game, it's not like you have a ton of options here. In regards to sprinting or just kind of navigating around the map, you'll just double tap the D-pad in whatever way you want to go. Combat, super simple, right? The B button is going to be your go-to for attacks. Alongside that, you'll have the R trigger for the Kamehameha, and you'll have L for Goku's power pole. And with that, I will say combos are pretty fun and rewarding to hit. Later on in the game, it might get a little stale, but the power pole and the Kamehameha keep things fresh in my opinion. In terms of graphics and sound, this is one of the best looking Game Boy Advance games. And I think the reason for that, I mean, as you can see, the backgrounds and stages are gorgeous. The sprites on the characters look good, and I think overall the game just looks really nice for a Game Boy Advance game. And I think the reason for that was by the time this came out, you got to figure most developers had pretty much figured out what made sense and how to pull all of the power out of the Game Boy Advance as they could. So graphically, this game looks incredible. I think the sound, not only in gameplay, but just the soundtrack and kind of theme songs in general sound pretty solid. It would have been obviously really cool sound-wise to have actual voice acting in the cutscenes, but hey, this is a Game Boy Advance game that originally released in 2004, so it is what it is. I will say the levels in this game are impressive for the age and definitely still a good time. At the end of the day, there's only so much you can do in a side-scrolling action platformer, but I feel like this game really kind of does all you can do in the best way possible. It stays fun. However, I will say certain levels definitely tend to drag on a bit, certain stages, and it almost seems like an endless, almost infinite swarm of enemies at times can respawn, and you kind of just have to skip past them, it feels like, and go on to the next part of the level. So I guess that's one kind of small complaint I have about the game, but other than that, I think you're in for a great time. In terms of game modes and just overall what you get in this package, for the age, there's quite a bit here, and especially for it being a Dragon Ball game. So one, obviously you have the story mode, which is pretty fun in my opinion, and I enjoy it. I think it's a good time. Mind you, I'm super nostalgic for Dragon Ball. Outside of the story, you have a one-on-one mode, which basically turns this game from action platformer into full-fledged fighter. And with that, fun aerial combat, fun combos you can pull off. Is it the most in-depth fighting game in the world? No, but it's definitely entertaining and fun to play outside of the story mode. So yeah, I was a huge fan of them having this mode and would have been really cool to play this against a friend back in the day. Outside of the traditional beat 'em up action platforming aspects of the game, which are really fun, obviously, and then the one-on-one fighting, which can be a nice break in the action. On top of that, there's another layer to this game, and that layer is the mini games that are in this. I think the mini games are actually a really nice touch. They're not a huge chunk of the game by any means, but I think it was really cool that they put this in here, because typically in a beat 'em up, an action platformer, or just a traditional fighting game, there's not a whole lot on the bone other than just that whole fighting aspect of the game. So pretty cool they added it. Another part of the game that I enjoyed were the boss battles. I thought the boss battles were a good time. I thought most of the bosses were, not too easy. I wouldn't say too difficult either. You know how it is with a lot of these older school action platformers, where there's basically a gimmick to that boss, and once you kind of exploit that, it's GG's for the boss. So I think the bosses were cool. The finale with King Piccolo I thought was pretty legit, and the soundtrack on that one was incredible. All in all, I believe there's 30 total characters to unlock, which I think is an insane roster, especially for a Dragon Ball game from this period of time. So if you're wanting to go back and maybe run through the story mode again as someone like Tien, Krillin, King Piccolo, something like that, just to kind of use them if you're a fan of that character, I think it's a pretty dope option, and it's definitely something where I feel like the creators of this game went above and beyond to do for, hardcore fans. The story mode on this game is only going to take you a couple hours to beat, maybe even a hair under 2 hours if you're really hustling through the story, but if you want to collect everything, unlock all the characters, there's definitely a decent amount of replayability here. Like I said earlier, you can run through the story again as one of your favorite characters. Might be kind of cool to go through as Krillin or someone else, Yamcha for example, instead of just plowing through the story with Goku. One thing that was kind of sad after going back to this game is it got me curious, like, hey, what other Dragon Ball games are out there? And pretty slim pickings. You have I think it's 2 on the Nintendo DS, and I know for a fact I think one of them requires stylus control, which I'm not a fan of. If it was just traditional face buttons, I'd be down to give it a go, but I really don't want to deal with the stylus. And then there's also a original Dragon Ball game on Wii, which I've heard that one is pretty good. I've heard it's similar to this, even though it's missing some of the story, but it's basically just a 3D version of this, and from what I've heard isn't nearly as good. But if you know of an actual original Dragon Ball game that I'm unaware of somehow, please let me know, or at least even a DBZ game similar to this, I'd be super down to check out. Overall, if I have to put this on a scale of 1 to 10, especially considering the platform that it's on, I would say I give this game an extremely solid 9 out of 10. And I don't know, I feel like that's maybe a little high just because I'm so nostalgic for Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, but I think the platforming is great. I think the level design is pretty solid. The characters are fun. The combat's cool. The game doesn't get too repetitive or stale really at any points other than when some of the levels drag on a bit. And overall, I think this is a fun one and definitely worth having in your collection. But yeah, guys, that'll do it for today's video. Hope you liked it. Let me know what you think of Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure and if you've played it. And as usual, we'll catch you soon with another video.